Great.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome to the Yorktown Victory Center. My name is Jim Holloway, and I serve as Museum Education Services Director for the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Victory Center and to the Richard S. Reynolds Foundation Theater. Now, here at the Yorktown Victory Center, we spend most of our time in the 18th century, but tonight we're excited to delve a few decades into the future. We're going to focus a little bit on the 19th century, and tonight's lecture is sponsored by the York County Historical Committee in association with the York County Sesquicentennial of the American Civil War Committee, and we're pleased at the Victory Center to host tonight's lecture. And I'm excited to introduce Dr. Tom Crouch. I'm sorry.
Not a problem.
Spent all afternoon with him, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Tom Crouch, who is with us tonight to present his lecture, Mr. Lincoln's Air Force. And Dr. Crouch is Senior Curator of the Division of Aeronautics at the National Air and Space Museum. In his tenure at the Smithsonian, he has served both the National Air and Space Museum and the National Museum of American History in a variety of curatorial and administrative posts. And prior to coming to the Smithsonian, he was employed by the Ohio Historical Society as Director of Education and as Director, Ohio American Revolution Bicentennial Advisory Committee. Holds a BA from Ohio University, an MA from Miami University, and a PhD from the Ohio State University. And he also holds an honorary degree, Doctor of Humane Letters, conferred in June 2001 by the Wright State University. He is the author or editor of a number of books and many articles for both popular magazines and scholarly publications. And most of his work has been on aspects of the history of flight technology, including works on the Wright brothers and on balloon history. In the fall of 2000, President Clinton appointed Dr. Crouch to the chairmanship of the First Flight Centennial Federal Advisory Board, an organization created to advise the Centennial Flight Celebration on activities planned for the 100th anniversary a few years ago. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Crouch.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight to this wonderful museum. I go back and forth to Kitty Hawk 3 or 4 times a year to do things down at Wright Brothers. And I always stop along the way, but usually at Williamsburg or Jamestown. So it was nice to spend the whole day in Yorktown today and see some new balloon sites, in fact, that I'd never seen before, which was really kind of neat. As Jim said, I'm the Senior Curator of Aeronautics at the National Air and Space Museum, which means I'm sort of in charge of the airplane side of the museum on the Mall and the Haase Center as well that we have at Dulles Airport. So we hope we'll see some of you folks up there, those of you who haven't been there. But I'm usually speaking about the Wright brothers. I'm a biographer of the Wright brothers and the author of 4 other books on aspects of the Wright brothers, including the National Park Service handbook on the boys, Wilbur and Orville. But I'm here to talk about another favorite subject tonight, and that's ballooning, specifically ballooning in the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started here. People often forget that among the other things the Civil War was a technological war. For the first time in history, an army in the field was able to make use of things like the telegraph to connect commanders in the field with the president in the White House and other folks as well. Instantaneous communication, or at the speed of electricity anyway. Railroads, for the first time, were able to move troops from place to place over great distances rapidly. Things like submarines. The submarine Hunley, one of the Civil War submarines, was the first in human history to sink an enemy warship. Of course, it sank itself, too, which wasn't all that good, but it was the first to sink an enemy warship. Rapid-fire guns, ironclad ships, electrical mines, all kinds of things. And not just individual inventions, but the impact of the Industrial Revolution. You know, the production of uniforms and firearms and ammunition and everything that you need to fight a war was being done in the North, especially on an industrial basis that the world really hadn't seen before. So it really was a war of technology. And one of the technologies that was getting a workout was the balloon over there. And that, of course, is what we're going to talk about tonight. At the time of the Civil War, balloons were, 150 years old or so, not quite that old, almost 100 years old. The first human beings flew in this balloon on November 21st, 1783, sent up by the brothers Montgolfier, two French papermakers, who built hot air balloons. Here you can see the furnace down below. You superheat this balloon on the ground and let it go, and it has a little brazier inside the neck of the balloon that you feed straw into to kind of maintain the heat inside the envelope. But in these early primitive 18th century balloons, hot air balloons, you only stayed up for a very short period of time. But only a week after the first human beings flew in a hot air balloon, the first human beings flew in a gas balloon as well, designed and built by another Frenchman, Jacques-Alexandre César Charles, who had been inspired by, guess who, Benjamin Franklin. In fact, when the Montgolfiers flew, and when this balloon flew a week later, Franklin was there. At the time, as were the members of the Adams family, John Quincy Adams, 16 years old, was just blown away by the balloons. His diaries for that period are just full of wild excitement about the fact that human beings are taking to the air for the first time. The Americans, of course, the Jay family was there too. They were in Paris to negotiate the Treaty of Paris that was going to bring an end to the American Revolution. So it was kind of exciting for them to be giving birth to a new nation that was going to be dedicated to freedom at the very moment when people were breaking the chains of gravity and enjoying the freedom of the air for the first time. And they made that connection. They talked a lot about the connection between their political freedom and the new possibilities that the balloon might just open up. It took a while for the first free balloon flight in America. That happened in Philadelphia in January of 1793. A fellow named Jean-Pierre Blanchard, a Frenchman, flew from what was then the New Jail in Philadelphia. For those of you who know that part of Philadelphia, it's where the Penn Mutual building is now, across the street from and down a little bit from Independence Hall. During the course of the 19th century, the balloon, especially in America, more so than in Europe, was a thing of spectacle. Balloonists would set out in the spring, like Charles Fersen Durant here, and they would travel the country during the spring, summer, and fall, making ascents. They would sell tickets, and people would pay to come in and watch them inflate the balloons and fly. And there were a whole string of these peripatetic itinerant aeronauts crisscrossing the United States. And these are the guys, many of them, who are going to become balloonists, military balloonists, during the Civil War. As I said, Franklin was a witness to all of those first balloon flights in Paris in the summer and the fall of 1783. And on the occasion of that first gas balloon flight that I showed you, Franklin, who had gout, was there as Jacques Charles' guest. People in France at the time obviously knew that Benjamin Franklin was a diplomat representing what was going to become this new nation. But they thought of him in much more important ways as a natural philosopher, the kind of guy we call a scientist today. When Franklin's work on electricity was published in France, again, it just caused an enormous wave of excitement. Jacques Charles, the guy who flew that first French gas balloon, was a lawyer and petit fonctionnaire, a government bureaucrat, when he read Franklin's book on electricity, and it changed his life. He gave up the law and sort of became an itinerant lecturer on science and so on and so forth, and became an important chemist. And he owed that to Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin was invited to all of these ascents. When the first human beings to fly, they flew out of Paris, got back to Paris at night. First place they went was to the Hotel de Valentinois, which Franklin was renting as his home to report what had happened. Before they went anyplace else, they came to Franklin's home. So on the occasion of that first gas balloon flight, Franklin, who, as I said, had gout, hadn't gotten out of his carriage. He had come down to watch the balloon go. And after it had gone out of sight and all that, he heard someone in the crowd say, well, okay, so those guys flew, but what possible use could that have? At which point Franklin says that he leaned out of his carriage and said, sir, of what use is a newborn babe? Franklin had no idea what use the balloon was going to have, but he knew it would be useful. And once he started to think about it, the first use that he came up with was military reconnaissance, observation. And 10 years after the invention of the balloon, 11 years, in the spring of 1794, that's what the French began doing. The French created a balloon corps, Corps de Roustiers, that went into operation at about the time of the Battle of Fleurus and the Battle of Charleroi, when the armies of the French Revolution were fighting the Austrians and so on. And they used balloons for reconnaissance during those early European campaigns, and up till the time of the invasion of Egypt. The balloons were sent along on a ship with Napoleon during the invasion, and they were lost at Aboukir Bay. The ship they were on were sunk, and Napoleon wasn't crazy about the balloons either. So the French Balloon Corps went out of business after a few years. But they've broken the surface, and it's the American Civil War when the balloon really shows its potential for the first time to a much greater extent than it had during the wars of the French Revolution. All of the balloons that you're going to see during the war were essentially gas balloons, and they were tethered gas balloons. Occasionally, people would make free flights, but, since you might ascend and get blown over enemy lines and captured, they just didn't do that very often. It made a lot more sense to tether the balloon over one spot and look over the enemy lines with your field glasses. And these were three of the guys who attempted to establish balloon corps before it was actually done. This fellow over here on your right is John LaMountain. He was an upstate New Yorker who had been ballooning for 5 or 6 years at the time the Civil War began. And like so many of these pre-war balloonists, by the time you get to the late 1850s, he had dreamed of flying the Atlantic in a balloon. In fact, he had made one long flight from St. Louis all the way to Henderson County, New York, as sort of a demonstration in preparation for a flight across the Atlantic. Unfortunately, his balloon was destroyed when it landed, so he was forced to give up the notion of flying the Atlantic. This guy, have to kind of walk myself over so I can see, is John Wise. John Wise was probably the senior American balloonist when the Civil War began. He was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and like these other two guys, was one of these peripatetic aeronauts who went from one county fair to the next, 4th of July celebrations, whatever you have, all summer long, selling tickets and making balloon flights. He was officially the first chief aeronaut of the United States, and we'll get back to him in a second. And the guy over on the far side, over there, that's James Allen, who was a Rhode Island man. And those of you who know the war know that very early on, Lincoln and the whole federal government were frightened because they had Virginia to the south and Maryland to the north, and no one was sure which direction Maryland was going to jump. And so for the first few weeks, it was really sort of worrisome, the danger of the Confederates potentially crossing the Potomac and taking over Washington. James Allen was in the Rhode Island Regiment, one of the first to reach Washington after the war began, and this enormous sigh of relief went up because federal troops were finally arriving in the capital in large numbers. And when Allen came, he had been a balloonist again, and he brought his balloon with him. And he made the flight shown here. This is an illustration from one of the great illustrated newspapers of the period. I forget whether it's Leslie's or Harper's, but one of the two. And you can see he's actually back here about a mile below the Capitol. And there's the unfinished Capitol of the United States. And there's the Smithsonian down here. And you can see the unfinished Washington Monument. And so he made this flight, which was, in fact, the first operational flight of the Civil War. But Allen didn't have good connections, and he never came close to establishing a balloon corps. In fact, as we'll see, he eventually goes to work for Thaddeus Lowe, who does finally establish the balloon corps. And that leaves this guy, John LeMountain, the fellow who had flown from St. Louis to upstate New York. LeMountain was a really energetic guy. The war was barely underway when he began making a whole series of flights in Alexandria, in Virginia, across the Potomac. And then, at Benjamin Butler's invitation, came down here to the peninsula with a balloon and began making flights from Fort Monroe in July of 1861. And he's making the first real operational flights ever by an American military aeronaut, and certainly the first of the Civil War. Here he is down here on at Fort Monroe, right? It's hard for me to see where there we go, where my pointer's pointing. And again, he was making observation flights, watching for the Virginia, the Merrimack, coming out into Hampton Roads, and just counting Confederate artillery positions and doing that kind of thing, with the Virginia area being watched from Fort Monroe. He does a couple of other things for the first time, too. Lowe often gets credit for inventing the aircraft carrier in America, but in fact, John LeMountain was using this ship, the Fanny, she was a steam tug, in August of 1861 down at Hampton Roads, and it was the first time that a military aeronaut had flown from a boat in the water, which was a pretty good idea. It's a way to get closer to the enemy down there. So LeMountain was down there making flights of up to 2,000, 3,000 feet through August of 1861, after which, looking for greener pastures, he traveled up to New York and attempted to talk the Army into letting him create a balloon corps. And ultimately, he had a real struggle with Thaddeus Lowe, this fellow, and Lowe wins. to become the fellow who actually creates the balloon corps for the Union Army and operates it through almost all of its entire career. He was a handsome fellow, as you can see, New Hampshireman. He had this thick New England accent. He wasn't all that well educated. When the war began, he also was sort of a peripatetic Mr. Wizard, or Bill Nye the Science Guy. He would travel from town to town giving science demonstrations, selling tickets and that kind of thing. At one point, he was in a town where a balloonist was coming through, fed up with trying to make money with a balloon, low bought it, and a little cockpit time, and lo and behold, he becomes an aeronaut himself. And after really stunningly few flights, he decides he wants to fly the Atlantic too. And this is sort of a fanciful, but not completely fanciful view of a balloon that he built in 1859 called the City of New York, as you can see. And that's because he was trying to raise money in New York, so he named it after the city. It didn't go well, the fundraising, so ultimately he moves from New York down to Philadelphia, and he renames the balloon the Great Western, a comment on the Great Eastern Steamship, which was flying, traveling the ocean from Europe to America, and he's going to fly from America to Europe, so he called it the Great Western. It didn't make the Atlantic crossing. He made some free flights in New York and in Philadelphia, and ultimately the balloon burst, and so he had to give up that dream as well. So what's Low going to do if he can't fly the Atlantic? He actually wrote to the Secretary of the Smithsonian in Washington. At the time, that was Joseph Henry, the first Smithsonian secretary. And Henry was sort of the unofficial chief scientist of the United States. He was interested in meteorology, among other things, and he had paid a lot of attention to the balloonists and what they were learning about the circulation of the wind in the atmosphere and that kind of thing. So Low wrote to him for advice and said, you know, my Atlantic balloon blew up. I haven't given up on the dream. What do you think I should do to sort of get back on my feet? And Henry said, well, why don't you do what those other guys have done? Go to the middle of the country and make a flight to the Atlantic coast. Prove that you can fly a long way. And maybe investors will show up at your doorstep and you'll be able to make the Atlantic flight. So, in April 1861, you Civil War buffs pay attention to the date up there. He takes off from Cincinnati and he flies almost to the Atlantic coast, to the Outer Banks, and then gets blown back around and winds up in the improbably named for April 1861 town of Unionville. And suffice to say, Unionville is not in favor of the Union. And so this guy with a thick New England accent falls out of the sky at their feet. And they immediately arrest him. They think he's a spy. Fortunately, somebody in the neighborhood had seen Low's picture in the illustrated newspapers, and so they let him go. He was actually rearrested, but he eventually gets back north. And at that point, the war's begun. And he decides that he wants to contribute to the war effort using the balloons. So he writes to his buddy again, Joseph Henry, this fellow, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, and says just that. You know, I've got my balloon, Enterprise, and I want to contribute. What should I do? And basically Henry says, well, pack up the balloon and your wife, and come on to Washington and we'll see what we can do to help you. And what he does, as soon as Low registers at the National Hotel and walks across the mall to the Smithsonian, is to walk him down to the White House and introduce him that very day to Abraham Lincoln. Now, when people think about Lincoln, they think many things. but they don't often think about the fact that he was fascinated by technology. To this day, Lincoln is the only American president ever to hold a U.S. patent. He had patented, when he was in the Congress in the 1840s, this device, which was a sort of strange contraption for lifting Western steamboats off sandbanks where they were stuck. It was a way to lift them off. And Lincoln was really proud of that patent. Many years later, his son, his oldest son, Robert, remembered that when Lincoln was in Congress, Mary Lincoln and Robert had stayed at home in Springfield. But Robert remembered coming to visit his father at one point in Washington, and the only thing Lincoln wanted to do was to walk his kid down to the patent office and show him his patent model. He was just hugely proud of it and hugely fascinated by technology, period. He spent a lot of time at the Navy Yard looking at new weapons and talking to the engineers and the arms makers about new ideas for weaponry. He was just absolutely fascinated by technology. So when Lowe sits down and talks to him, he's really interested. And he gives the Smithsonian $250 for Lowe to make a demonstration flight. And so on June 18th, 1861, Lowe flies right in front, I can't even see where my pointer is, of that classical-looking building over there, which is the Columbia Armory. It's where the District of Columbia stored its small arms and ammunition and that kind of thing. And ironically, and one of the reasons I started doing these talks and became involved in the 150th anniversary is that that building stands on the spot where my museum, your museum, the National Air and Space Museum, stands today on the mall. So he made that first reconnaissance flight right in front of where our building is. And I included this just to show you what a balloon inflation at that time looked like. And also because I'm hugely fond of this photograph. I collected it, in fact, about 20 years ago. And it is, in fact, the oldest known photograph anywhere of a balloon, of a human-constructed flying machine. Here's the mall as it was in the spring of 1861. Zoop, there's the Smithsonian down there, and the U.S. Capitol, and right in here, that's the Armory. And that's where that first flight was made on June 18th, 1861. It was also the first time a telegram had ever been sent from the air. Again, it was a tethered flight, and Lowe took up a telegrapher and the president of the telegraph company who'd insisted on a balloon ride. And from up there, they sent that telegram that you see there, which is in our collection today, to President Lincoln in the White House. And what it says, basically, is Lowe is just explaining what he can see from 500 feet in the air, and giving Lincoln a notion of how useful for the Army it would be to have balloons up in the air for reconnaissance. I included this just to show you what a balloon ascent would have looked like at the time. When that flight was finished on June 18th, they pulled the balloon down, and when you're flying a tethered balloon like that, you need all of these handlers on the ground. They're going to hold the lines that keep the balloon tethered to the ground. And these guys walked the balloon down the mall and turned right and walked it right up to the White House. And Lincoln comes out, and Lowe talks to him from the basket. Lincoln invites him into the White House, and in fact, he invites Lowe to spend the night in the White House. And they stay up till the wee hours talking about the potential for aerial reconnaissance and the use of balloons. And Lincoln's just absolutely fascinated and says, we want to do this. So Lowe goes away the next morning thinking, okay, we're all set. Well, he begins trying to get in to see Winfield Scott, the Chief of Staff for the United States Army, the head of the U.S. Army. And Scott won't give him the time of day. He won't see him, won't let him into the office. And this goes on day after day. Lowe is really struggling. Well, in July, about a month later, comes the first great battle of the war at Bull Run. And John Wise, whom I showed you a few minutes ago, had not been working with the White House. He didn't start at the top the way Lowe did. He'd been working with the Army Corps of Engineers. And a Corps of Engineers officer, the day before the Battle of Bull Run, sent Wise down to the Washington Gas Works, which was right next to the Columbia Armory, where our building is today. And he found Lowe there filling his balloon at the Washington Gas Works. The best gas to fill a balloon with was hydrogen. Hydrogen's the lightest element known. And so that's ideally what you use. But hydrogen's hard to generate, as we'll see. So when these guys were operating in a city, they would fly with city gas. Coal gasification, of course, turned out illuminating gas, and every major city in the country by this time had a gas plant and was pumping gases into streetlights and houses and everything else. So these guys would just go to the gas works, put their balloon over the gas main, and off they'd go. Lowe was inflating that morning when the Corps of Engineers orders Wise down there, and they actually order Wise to take his balloon off the gas main. John Wise blows his balloon up, they tie it down in a wagon, and they start for Manassas, Bull Run, about 30 miles south of Washington. And they're almost there on the day of the battle. They can hear the guns. When the balloon, again, it's tied down in this wagon, so it's a tough trip, gets caught in tree branches, torn, and that's the end of John Wise's balloon. And in fact, John Wise's career as chief aeronaut of the Union Army. Of course, the Union loses the Battle of Bull Run, and a few weeks later, Wise ran into a Union officer on the streets of Washington who, with kind of a smirk, said to him, "Well, Professor Wise, the balloon didn't do so well at the battle." And Wise looked him straight in the eye and said, "Well, the balloon part was about as good as the battle part." And I love that story. So everybody has come and gone, and Lowe is literally the last guy standing. So after Bull Run, Lincoln actually says to Lowe, "Come back to the White House." And he kind of puts Lowe on the carpet. And he says, "You know, we fought the Battle of Bull Run, and you were not there. The balloon might have made a difference that day." And Lowe says, "Well, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but here's what's happened. General Scott won't see me, and they order me off the gas mains." And Lincoln becomes sort of angry. And he says, "You know, we're going to have a balloon corps, and you're going to create it." So he gives this note, which is also in our collection, to Lowe to go over to the War Department and see Winfield Scott. And as you can see, it says, "Will Lieutenant General Scott please see Professor Lowe over his balloon?" And it's dated July 25th, just after Bull Run. Scott still wouldn't see him even then. So Lowe went back to Lincoln, and Lincoln actually walked him across the street at that point, walks him into Scott's office, and basically says, "General, talk to this guy. He's got an idea that we're going to take advantage of." And so Thaddeus Lowe was finally on his way. Initially, the Army gives him enough money to build one new balloon. The balloon that he had used on the Mall was the Enterprise, the balloon that he had flown from Cincinnati to South Carolina. And it was only a single ply of silk and wasn't a real rugged balloon. So Lowe immediately built a military balloon with double layers of silk and much sturdier than his civilian balloons had been. And he began making ascents in the Washington area initially. When that worked out, the Army said, "Okay, go ahead and order all the balloons you need for this experiment." And so in the end, Lowe built 6 more balloons, and you can see them there. They were of different sizes. The 30,000 up there, for example, is 30,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. So you can see they come all the way from 30,000 feet, 32,000 cubic feet, down to 15,000 cubic feet. And they're capable of listing 4, 5, 3, 2, down to a single man. So Lowe has a variety of balloon sizes that he's ready to take into combat. Here's what they look like. This is sort of an old-fashioned typical view of Intrepid, which was the first of those military balloons that we just looked at. Again, it's made out of double layers of silk, really tough. This view of the balloon is one that appeared on a U.S. postage stamp a couple of decades ago. And it's a pretty good vision of what the balloon looked like. But now we know that, in fact, they were a good deal brighter than this, and this is the other side of this balloon. Indeed, this balloon had Intrepid written on one side, and on the other side was the eagle, cross flags, and the hero of the hour, Little Mac, George McClellan, who was the commander of the Army of the Potomac at the time, and never anyone to miss a step when it came to public relations. Lowe had put his picture on the balloon. So Lowe has 7 balloons ready to go into action. He obviously can't fly 7 balloons himself. So he hires a bunch of folks, including James Allen, who we talked about, and his brother Ezra. And the rest of these guys are pre-war exhibition balloonists that Lowe hires for the Balloon Corps. This operation is the Aeronautic Corps, as they call themselves, is in fact the first military aviation unit in United States history. But in fact, these guys are never in the Army. They're always contractors. The Army refused to commission Lowe or any of his balloonists. In fact, they actually refuse to trust these guys. When they're flying, as we'll see down here on the peninsula, they are never by themselves. They're always flying with an Army officer who's in charge of making the observations and all of that. Some more support staff, including Lowe's father. You need at least 20, 30, 40 soldiers to operate with the balloons. And basically, from the beginning of the Peninsula Campaign, Lowe drew men from a single main regiment. They took 2 or 3 guys from each company so they wouldn't decimate a company and assigned them to the balloon. And Lowe trained those guys, and those are the guys that he operated with. As I said, initially he filled the balloons with city gas when he was in Washington. But of course in the field there weren't gas works. So Lowe had to figure out how to generate gas to fill his balloons when he was away from a city gas plant. And what he did was to invent inflation wagons, these things. It's a standard Army wagon with a big tub on the top here, a wooden vat, and you're going to fill that vat with dilute sulfuric acid, oil of vitriol, and iron filings. And of course hydrogen bubbles off in the chemical reaction when you mix those two. The gas bubbles up, comes through the leather pipes, and here's a photograph of them, and comes down through this washer, which is just full of water. When the gas comes out of the inflation wagons, it's hot and it's acidic. So they use plain water to cool it down. They literally just bubble the hydrogen up, and it bubbles up and through this pipe and into this washer, and that one's full of lime water, which they use to deacidify the the gas that's being generated. And this tells you a little something about what an industrial operation it was. Again, 40 gallons of sulfuric acid and 1,600 pounds of iron filings, and that is for a single balloon inflation. So, this is no penny-ante operation that we're talking about. Here are the balloon wagons on the mall. In fact, this photograph, taken in 1862, I wanted to find out exactly where it was taken. So a friend and I went out on the mall and took my picture in roughly the same relationship to the Capitol, and I'm standing right in front of our building on the mall. So that's how we knew where that photograph was taken. They operated up and down the Potomac early on in the war. This is a map that was made by a captain named Small, and the balloon was tethered over here in Charles County on the Maryland shore, and this is the Potomac. And up here you can see Confederate gun emplacements, military camps, and so on. That's Dumfries and Quantico, for those of you who know that part of Northern Virginia. And again, it's another example of officers having to fly with the balloonists. I have Lowe's field glasses, and with them, Lowe gave the Smithsonian a list of the officers who had used the field glasses and looked from the balloons at Confederate lines. And it starts with George McClellan at the top, comes down through the whole Army leadership, which flew with the balloons, down to Lieutenant George Armstrong Custer, who flew with the balloons down here on the peninsula. So it was quite an operation. Just as John LeMountain had used the Fanny down at Fort Monroe, Lowe actually had his own aircraft carrier built at the Navy Yard, the George Washington Parke Custis, and this shows how the thing was used. They used it on the Potomac, like that last picture I showed you was at Budd's Ferry, below Washington, and once the Peninsula Campaign started, they brought the G.W. Parke Custis down the river, down the bay, through Hampton Roads, and up first the York and then the James, so that Lowe, during the campaign, could fly from the water as well as the land. And this is just a picture of the deck of the Custis with the two inflation things in place. He was also experimenting with night lighting. Here he's burning lime to illuminate Confederate batteries, again, across the Potomac in Northern Virginia. Early on in the war, the balloons did lots of things. He had sent one of his aeronauts, John Steiner, with one of the little balloons, the Eagle, out to the western rivers. And at the time of the attack on Confederate forces on Island Number 10, Steiner was up on the Eagle, tethered to a Union gunboat. The Union gunboats could not see the Confederate gun emplacements on the island that day, and Steiner could see them from the balloon. So he literally walked the Federal guns onto the Confederate gun emplacements, and of course they reduced Island Number 10 and won. It was one of Grant's early great victories of the war, and it's one of the early examples of artillery spotting done by the balloons. So mostly the balloons are going to be used for reconnaissance, but not entirely. They do artillery spotting and other duties as well. So the Peninsula Campaign, as all of you know, I think, the first thing the Army had done was to try to move south from Washington to attack Richmond. And that had ended at Bull Run, didn't work all that well. So George McClellan decides they're going to try a different tack. They're going to begin in Alexandria, come down the Potomac, down Chesapeake Bay, around this way, down to the peninsula, and come at the enemy from the south, up the peninsula, landing at Fort Monroe and marching up the peninsula to Richmond. So McClellan gets permission to undertake this campaign, and the balloons go with him. And it's the shining moment for the balloons. They're never more important than they were during the Peninsula Campaign. Lowe shows up down here on April 15th, 1862. He actually came down on board the G.W. Parke Custis, towed by a steam tug. So he doesn't come down with the rest of the army. He comes down a little later with his balloons and with the Custis. This is an early image of by a Union soldier whose work you see in a lot of museums in Richmond and down here, and it shows the balloons early on at the time of the siege of Yorktown. I think most of you know the story of the siege of Yorktown. McClellan, whose great problem in life is that he's always convinced that he's outmanned, that the Confederates always have more troops than he does. He just refuses to attack until he is certain he has an overwhelming advantage. And at Yorktown, during the siege, he's convinced that the Confederates have a lot more troops than he does. What's actually happening, of course, is that John Magruder, the Confederate commander, is marching his troops around in such a way to confuse Union intelligence officers and convince McClellan that there are a lot more Confederates over there than there actually are. And this is taking place during early May of 1862. Comes May 3rd, and in fact it's during this period when Lowe actually flies a reporter for the first time, Arthur Lumley from the New York Illustrated. On May 3rd, 1862, the Confederate artillery fire really picks up, and Lowe is afraid to fly that day. When he goes up the next day, on May 4th, he notices immediately that the Confederates are gone. They've abandoned their lines at Yorktown, and they've moved north up the peninsula. They have hornswoggled George McClellan. But it raises the question of balloons and ground fire during the war. During the entire course of the Civil War, no balloon, Union or Confederate, was ever hit by ground fire. What they would do, there were times when it was real dangerous, when you're close to the ground and you're liable to damage by small arms fire and artillery as well. What you want to do is get up just as fast as you can. Once they were at an altitude of 500 feet or so, they were out of the range of small arms, and they were above the point where cannon could be elevated to fire at them, so they were perfectly safe. And again, during the entire war, no balloon was ever hurt by ground fire, but it could worry the aeronauts. And I mean, down here, there were other problems as well. They had to worry about weather, and this is the Eagle in a storm with its crew struggling to keep it from being blown away. Here is the Washington, and as you can see, they are surrounding it with cut timber as a windbreak, and they've got their inflation stuff and all that down here. So it was tough handling the balloons. As the armies move north up the peninsula, the balloons move with them. Pretty quickly, they get up to an area near the Gaines Farm. In fact, here's a contemporary drawing, not very clear, but it shows you what the balloon camp looked like at that point. And it underscores how difficult it is to operate the balloons. You have 2 inflation wagons here. You have 2 other wagons that you have to use to carry all of the cordage you need to operate the balloons. And again, those gallons of sulfuric acid and tons of iron filings, and the 30 guys you have to maintain the balloons. So the balloon train is not easy. Just a notion of what load looked like in the air. You see this tiny little basket. Just as there were different sized balloons, he used different sized baskets as well. And this is the one that he used with his smaller balloons. He regularly telegraphed, this is Lowe, during the Peninsula Campaign, sending off a report. Again, he went up with an Army officer, and they would telegraph what they had seen to McClellan or some other commander so that he could take action. Here's Lowe again in one of the early Brady photographs, sending a telegram. By mid-May or so, they are actually, when they're up in the air in the balloon, they are in sight of Richmond. And Richmond sees them as well. It was part of what Lowe's thinking was, getting the Confederate capital really worried. If they can see the Union balloons, they know the Union Army is close to the gates of Richmond. It's one of the reasons the balloons were painted bright yellow, bright red, and that kind of thing. Lowe wasn't worried about camouflaging his balloons. He wanted the enemy to see them. He wanted them to know that they were there, and if it was a military commander, he's got to hide his troops so that the balloons can't see them. Or if it's civilians in Richmond, he wants them to have something to think about. Here's the balloon camp at Gaines Mill. We've rediscovered this site. If you go to the Civil War Trust's website and search Civil War balloons, you can see a video with me and my buddy Jim Green and Mike Bomey standing down where this spot is now. The Civil War Trust is in the process of purchasing this balloon site. And as you can see, it's down in kind of a swale. Here's the ridge over here with the Gaines house up there, and Little Powhite Creek is down here. You have to have water for the inflation wagons. That's an essential element, balloon camp on water. And if they can, down in a hollow. The Confederate artillery can't see them when they're down there, not until they rise up above the ridge. And again, at the same time, they're protected from the wind and the elements. So that's where they operated for a good long time during the Peninsula Campaign, while Lowe was spying on the Confederates. Here they are a little later during the actual battle fighting around Gaines Mill. And again, you can see that same area that we just looked at in the painting in this drawing as well. It was a tough place to be, in a sense. They were protected, but they were also vulnerable. After Gaines Mill, McClellan decides that he has to reform his lines. And in fact, he reformed his lines behind this balloon camp. So Lowe and his guys had to get out of there pretty quickly. And they got the balloons out, they got themselves out, and all the wagons, but they didn't get the inflation wagons out. And the Confederates actually captured them and drug them in triumph through the streets of Richmond. When you go to Richmond National Battlefields today, you can still see the big valve from the top of one of the hydrogen generating wagons that the Confederates captured at Gaines Mill. Here, in fact, this was taken in that same area. Here's that ridge. This is the Intrepid, and this is the smaller Constitution down here. And what he's doing, again, it takes 3 to 4 hours to inflate a balloon. So he's using one balloon, the Constitution down here, as a gas reservoir to top off the Intrepid so that they can make a flight. And in fact, that Brady photograph was taken not very long before the Confederates forced them to run. That's Little Powhite Creek down here. And here they are in that same area with the inflation wagons. Inflation wagon 11 and 12. 12 of them were built, and these are the two that the Confederates captured that day. Again, just another picture of Low, not very high in the air in that small basket. The fighting continued, of course. Seven Pines, Savage Station, the rest of the 7 days battles. And McClellan now has lost heart with this huge army of his. He's already decided to forget Richmond and try to pull his army to safety back down the peninsula, back down to Fort Monroe and back to Washington. And at this point, the balloons are mostly operating from the water again, from the GW Parke Custis. Here's just another Brady photograph of Low at Harrison's Landing. Once the retreat down the peninsula begins, McClellan orders the army to shift from the White House on the Pamunkey, on the York River, across the peninsula to the Harrison's Landing on the James River, and that's where GW Parke Custis is going to be operating. This is a drawing of John Steiner and James Allen flying from the GW Parke Custis down here, and it's Tug. Of course, on the peninsula, the Union Army was not the only army with balloons. The Confederates had them too. This is a piece of silk from the most famous Confederate balloon operating here on the peninsula, called the Gazelle, or sometimes called the Lady Davis in honor of Varina Davis. Longstreet called it the silk dress balloon because it was made of dress silk that had been seized in bolts and put together to form the balloon. And this, fortunately, this piece that survives in the museum shows where 4 different silk patterns come together. For the most part, the Gazelle was flown by E.P. Alexander, probably the most famous Confederate artillery officer of the war. At First Manassas, he had been the guy from a signal tower who had seen the Union Army trying to flank the Confederates. And down here on the peninsula, he was hugely fond of the balloons. He flew quite a few times and talks about it in his memoir. The fellow over here on your right is John R. Bryan, who actually flew here in the Yorktown area in front of Lee Hall in a hot air balloon that wasn't very successful, but was very interesting. I found a great description by a Confederate private marching past Lee Hall, and he sees Bryan struggling with the balloon, and it's not a pretty picture that he paints. So that's the end of the balloons on the peninsula. Again, they worked better than down here than they would at any other time during the war. But by the end of 1862, they're being used at Fredericksburg, and the following spring at Chancellorsville again in May of 1863. And of course, it's after Chancellorsville that Lee begins moving north toward eventually Gettysburg. And the Union Army is moving north, screened from Lee on this side of the Blue Ridge. And the Army's really moving quickly, and the balloons can't keep up. They get to Harper's Ferry, and the Army Halleck orders them to stay at Harper's Ferry. So they don't get to Gettysburg, and in fact, they don't get to leave Harper's Ferry again. That was the last time that the balloons were actually flown in combat. Lowe is getting angry with Army administration at this point. He's not getting paid the way he thinks he should, so he can't pay his guys. And Lowe, being Lowe, puts his feet down and says he's going to quit if the Army doesn't begin doing things his way. And the Army says, okay. And Lowe is out of the Balloon Corps. I think he always hopes the Army will come back on bended knee and say, don't go, don't go. But they didn't. A lot of federal officers, especially, unfortunately for Lowe, McClellan and the officers who had fought down here on the peninsula were in favor of the balloons, enjoyed them, flew with them, thought they were getting good information from them. But as the war goes on, a new generation of officers who haven't had that much experience with the balloons take command and have very little interest in continuing the experiment. Lowe tries to start it up again in 1864, and the Army just turns them down. So it's the end of the Balloon Corps, but not the end of balloons in combat. The European officers who were serving with the Union Army, Count von Zeppelin, for example, and the Comte de Paris, and English officers as well, had seen what the balloons did during the Peninsula Campaign. They went back to Germany, France, and England, and they actually started their own balloon corps over there in the late 1860s and the early 1870s. So for the rest of the century, in the European wars, like the Franco-Prussian War, for example, both sides going to be operating balloons in a big way. And in colonial campaigns, the French in North Africa and Indochina, the British in South Africa, they make big use of balloons. And we kind of restart the experiment during the Spanish-American War, and it doesn't work all that well, so the Europeans take better advantage of it than we do. But by the time the First World War comes along, and the value of aerial reconnaissance becomes crystal clear, aerial reconnaissance is what ultimately leads to the loss of rapid movement between the Allied and Central Powers armies and the beginning of trench warfare. And for the rest of the war, aerial reconnaissance is just incredibly important. And it's not just airplanes, it's balloons as well. Kite balloons on both sides of the lines. And of course airplanes shooting them down. This guy, an American officer, his balloon has been attacked by an airplane, and he is making a parachute jump, which they did a lot. And to this day, aerial reconnaissance is one of the most important things in military and national defense and international relation terms. One of the most important things we do with the fact that we can fly from traditional aerial reconnaissance with airplanes to what we do today with spacecraft. So while the Union Army Balloon Corps came to an end in 1863, ultimately the lessons that it taught with regard to aerial reconnaissance and that kind of thing survived. And that's one of the reasons that it's worth remembering the balloons today, because they honestly were the precursors of aerial reconnaissance and the kind of things that we see going on in the Middle East today with unmanned aerial vehicles and all of that. So, balloons in the Civil War. Thank you very much.